be seated. So let me ask you a question. What's the first picture that immediately pops into your mind when you hear the word generosity? Generosity. Maybe it's the picture of a parent or a grandparent who has always provided for you unselfishly. Or maybe it's the picture of someone who has and who gives large sums of money to various charitable organizations. Maybe it's another picture. I like the picture that Tom Long describes in regard to this. Tom is the Bandy Professor of Preaching at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. He teaches seminary students how to preach. And a while back, I had a chance to hear him speak, and he told about a picture that almost always pops into his mind when he hears the word generosity. Years ago, he had a seminary student whose father was an inner city pastor. And one afternoon, when the seminary student was at home during the Christmas break, he and his minister father began talking about this whole matter of ministry. The student talked about all of the things that he was learning in seminary. The father spoke of some of the struggles of inner city ministry. As the conversation went on, they decided to take a walk just to get some fresh air. And near the end of their walk, the father turned to his son and he said, "You know, it's about dinner time and I'm getting hungry. I tell you what, why don't we call and order a pizza, and then by the time we get to the house, it should be delivered." This was in the day before cell phones became very popular. So they started walking toward a pay telephone when all of a sudden they were approached by a homeless man who asked, "Have you got any spare money?" With that, the minister father reached deep into his pockets and he pulled out all of the money he had and he said, "Here, take what you want." And surprised, the homeless man said, "Well, then I'll take it all." And he started sweeping the money into his hand. And afterward, he turned and began to leave. He had only gotten a few steps when the father suddenly realized that he no longer had any money to make the telephone call. So he called out to the homeless man and he said, "Excuse me, I was going to make a phone call, but I don't have any money. Could I borrow a quarter?" And with that, the homeless man turned, walked back to them, extended his hands, and said, "Here, take what you want." What's the first picture that immediately pops into your mind when you hear the word generosity? Obviously, there's no way we can know this for sure, but I've got a hunch that if you were to ask Jesus what picture jumped in to the forefront of his mind when he heard the word generosity, at least one of the pictures that he might provide would be the story of that woman that we read a moment ago in our gospel lesson. You remember the scene? Jesus was at the end of his public ministry, and he had just finished cautioning the disciples about the subtle spiritual dangers of things like possessions and prestige and power. Now he sat across from the temple treasury. The temple treasury consisted of 13 large brazen receptacles that were shaped like trumpets that lined the court of women. It was the place where people brought their offerings. And Jesus had sat there and he'd watched a number of people come by and drop their offerings into the receptacles. Some of them were quite large. And that was when it happened. Out of the corner of his eye, Jesus noticed a poor widow who approached the receptacles. How did he know that she was poor? Had Jesus met her before? Could he tell by the way that she was dressed? Had someone told him about her? We don't really know for sure. Whatever the case, Jesus watched as she reached out and dropped 2 small coins into the receptacle. Now, scholars tell us that according to today's standards, the buying power of what she dropped into those receptacles amounted to about 1/20th of a penny. A few weeks ago, someone came by after one of our worship services and gave me a couple of coins. I'm a little bit embarrassed because I don't remember who it was. There was a lot going on and I just don't remember. If you're in here this morning, thank you for giving these to me. They were brought back from Israel, where they were purchased from a licensed Israeli antiquity dealer. And they amount to the 2 mites that the poor widow would have put into the receptacle. These are likely very similar coins. You can't see them from where you're sitting, but I want to just leave them up here on the altar. And after the service, if you'd like to come by, you're welcome to take a look at them. Compared to what others had given, it was nothing. But it was enough to capture Jesus' attention, because we're told that he turned to his disciples and said something like this: "Did you see that?" "See what?" "Did you see what that woman put into the receptacles?" "Yeah, so?" "Well," said Jesus, "I think you ought to know that she has put in more than anyone else in this whole place." Given more than anyone else? How could she? Others had come by and put in large sums of money. What she had put in was so small. Why would Jesus say that? On the surface of it, it seems like his statement is a ludicrous one, doesn't it? Or was it? What was it that Jesus saw in her that he didn't see in others? And even more importantly, what is it that Jesus wants us as his disciples to see today? In the few minutes that we have remaining, I want to try and get at that. But I want to do it in a little bit of an unorthodox way. Instead of coming at it directly, I want to tell you, first of all, what I don't think Jesus saw in her. I don't think Jesus saw in her any fear, at least not as it related to giving back to God what God had already given to her. And let's be real, what had been given to her was about as meager as it gets. But when it came to giving back out of that, there was no fear. One of the things about this story that is so striking to me is how different her approach to giving is than the way many people approach giving. So often when we think about giving, there is in many of our minds this little voice in the back of our minds that says something to the effect, now remember, if you give this away, it means you will have less for yourself. And you need to be sure to take care of yourself first. And if you listen real carefully, the underlying fear behind that voice in our minds is the fear that the more we give away, the more insecure our lives become. And that's not really true. At least not if you believe what Paul wrote to Timothy in our first lesson this morning. You remember when Ashley read that passage just a few minutes ago, Paul wrote to Timothy and said, God has richly blessed us with everything for our enjoyment. And here's the real rub. According to sociologists and those statisticians who keep track of these sorts of things, the more we have, the louder that voice seems to grow, and the greater our fear becomes. You would think that it would be the other way around, wouldn't you? You would think that the less that a person had, the more likely they would to try and protect it. But study after study after study suggests that the more people have, the less likely they are to be willing to let go of it, which may be one reason why Jesus once suggested that it is harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. I love the story Peter Marshall tells. When he was chaplain of the United States Senate, a man one day approached him and he said, "Dr. Marshall, I've got a problem." And Dr. Marshall listened and he said, "I used to regularly tithe to my church, but," he said, "now I make $500,000 a year." And he said, "There's just no way I can afford to give $50,000 a year." And Dr. Marshall listened but offered no advice. And finally, when the man finished, Dr. Marshall said, I see your dilemma. I tell you what, why don't we just pray for a minute, shall we?" And the man agreed, and so they bowed their heads, and Dr. Marshall began to pray. He said, "Heavenly Father, I pray that you will reduce this man's salary until he can afford to be faithful to you." What Jesus saw when the poor widow approached the receptacles was no fear. No fear. I also don't think he saw what many today are calling a case of affluenza. Affluenza. Now, we all know what influenza is. It's a case of the flu. And some of us who are in here have struggled with that in recent days, and it's no fun, is it? But as serious as influenza can be, affluenza can be an even more serious disease, because affluenza consists of an all-consuming desire for more. That's what it is, an all-consuming desire for more. More money, more affluence, more stuff, more power, more prestige. You put in the blank. It's just this all-consuming desire for more. Do you remember that old story about the Standard Oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller? In his later years, Rockefeller was an extremely philanthropic individual, giving away hundreds of millions of dollars to his church, other churches, and charitable organizations all over the world. But in his early days, he was driven by this need for success. And after he had reached that point where he had achieved the kind of financial success that very few people, just a handful of people, ever reach, he was interviewed. During the course of the interview, the reporter turned to him and said, "Mr. Rockefeller, how much is enough?" Quick as a flash, he turned and he said, "Just a little bit more. Just a little bit more." Now that's a symptom of a case of affluenza. Jesus didn't see any of this in that poor widow. And I can hear some of you saying to yourself, "Well, that's because she didn't have anything to begin with. She had nothing to lose." But affluenza is not determined by how much you have. Affluenza is determined by the condition of your heart. And sometimes people can have very little and still have this all-consuming desire for more, to the point to where it becomes a god in their lives. And Jesus didn't see any of that in this poor widow. So what did Jesus see in her? I can tell you what I think. I think he saw in her an awareness that everything she had, little as it was still a gift from God. I think Jesus saw in her an attitude of gratitude for what she did have. Isn't it interesting how we sometimes concentrate more on what we don't have than on what we do have? She concentrated on what she did have, and she was grateful for it. I think he saw in her a desire to be faithful to the God who had been faithful to her. I think Jesus saw in her a simple trust that God could and would meet her needs. And I think Jesus saw in her a God-shaped heart. Scholars tell us that one of the interesting things about this story, placed as it is at the end of Jesus' public ministry, is that it's a hint It's a foreshadowing of what Jesus is about to do. Jesus is about to go to the cross and give his all in his love for you and me. This woman was giving her all in her love for God. She had a God-shaped heart. True generosity is always an expression of a God-shaped heart. One more story and we're finished. There's an old Jewish parable about a father who had two sons. The father was an ideal mentor. When the boys were just young enough to walk, he would take them out into the fields and teach them everything he knew about farming. And when he died, instead of dividing the inheritance, the two boys decided to continue to work the field together, each contributing his best gifts, and then they would still continue to divide the inheritance. In time, one of the sons married, built a little house on a piece of their property, and then had 8 children. The other brother remained a bachelor all of his days. But they still divided the harvest right down the middle. One night, after a particularly bountiful harvest, the bachelor brother was thinking to himself, and he started thinking, my brother has 10 mouths to feed and I only have one. My brother needs more than I do. But I know him. He's far too gracious to ever renegotiate our agreement. I know what I'll do. I'll slip into his barn. I'll take part of my harvest and I will put it into his barn. At the very same time, the other brother was thinking to himself, God has been so gracious to me. I have this wonderful family, and when my wife and I are older, our children will be there to take care of us. My brother is not so fortunate. But I know him. He's far too gracious to ever renegotiate the contract. I know what I'll do. I'll slip into his barn. I'll take part of my harvest and put it into his barn so that he will have a nest egg for the future. And as you might have guessed, one night when the moon was full, the two brothers, each on a mission of mercy, bumped in to each other and realized what the other was doing. And as the old rabbis tell the story, they say that night, even though there wasn't a cloud in the sky, a gentle rain began to fall. Why? Because God was weeping for joy, for here were two brothers who do not look at the world, who do not look at life the way the world sees it, but who have the kingdom eyes to see as God sees. Well, now we come to a very sacred time in the life of our church. We come to that moment where we're going to have an opportunity to present to God our estimate of giving card.